We had some final wrapping ups of the busy election season. It's finally over. It seems like it lasted forever. But the Georgia runoff, we had a final result, and incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock secured his reelection against Republican challenger Herschel Walker to, at the time at least, solidify a 51-49 split for Democrats. But just this morning as we're recording, we actually have some breaking news that throws that, I guess, and throws that off a little bit. If you want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Senate. Well,
so at first, I think just talk about that Georgia race real quick, just to wrap things up. We did the podcast last week, and on the podcast we talked about how guns weren't necessarily a large issue, leading issue in that race. It wasn't something that the candidates were focused on a lot, although the NRA certainly did get involved heavily in the race and spent, I think, it's over $3 million if I'm remembering correctly, whereas the gun control groups, I think, spent less than $100,000 combined. And so that was an interesting dynamic, but the outcome there is bad for gun rights advocates or gun rights activists because, well, for one, the NRA wildly outspent the gun control groups, so losing is not presumably not what they were going for. And two, although this one's going to change a little bit with the what we're going to talk about in a second, what's changed just recently here. But two, that it gives Democrats a larger majority to allow the president to appoint more judges. And obviously the president is staunchly in favor of stricter gun laws in the United States and generally appoints judges with that point of view as well. And so even though Democrats were going to have control of the Senate either way, this gives them a little more cushion in theory to push through some of these judicial appointments as well as some of the executive branch appointments. Obviously he's already filled the ATF position, but now any other position that may have an impact on gun policy that comes open, any of the law enforcement agencies in the federal government, for instance, or even places like Social Security, where they've the Obama administration tried to use executive rulemaking to add a lot of people from Social Security to the prohibited persons list or to the mixed background check system years ago and failed. Stuff like that, where you're trying to institute new gun restrictions through the executive branch, will be easier if you have the people in place that you want, and having a slightly larger majority in the Senate makes that easier to accomplish. However, Kyrsten Sinema out in Arizona, the Democrat, is no longer a Democrat, apparently. She has switched party affiliation, although not to the Republican Party, but to become an independent. Now, people who follow the Senate closely probably already know that she won't be the only independent. There are two other ones. Very famously, Bernie Sanders is technically an independent. And then, of course, Angus King in Maine is also technically an independent. It's not really clear yet how this is going to work out for Sinema. Obviously, in King and Sanders' case, they're basically just Democrats. They caucus with the Democrats. They vote with the Democrats in the vast majority of circumstances. If anything, they're maybe a little bit to the left of Democrats on a lot of issues. Although King did play an instrumental role in blocking President Biden's first ATF nominee. So, there's an example of how an independent perhaps had a significant role in this administration's gun policy in a way that maybe a Democratic senator wouldn't have done. I'm not sure that that's really the case. Usually in those situations where it was one person blocking something, it's usually there's a collection of senators who don't want that thing, and it's just one of them is the public face of it for that particular moment. But either way, it'll be very interesting to see how Sinema stacks up in all this, how she actually performs as a quote unquote independent, whether she caucuses with Democrats. I think to this point, she said she does not plan to caucus with the Democrats, but she does believe she's going to keep her committee assignments. And I'm not sure how that's going to work. So I don't know. What do you think? How does this affect the breakdown of the Senate in your mind?
I kind of agree with you. I think she'll play a similar role, at least from what she's saying so far. Obviously, this is still early stages, so things could get uglier down the road. But she said that she apparently is going to keep her committee seats. She said she plans to vote pretty similarly to how she has before. It's not like a wholesale change in her philosophy or anything. But I think she's been one of the more moderate senators, particularly on things like gun issues. Where
she voted for the bipartisan bill.
Right. She played a role in the bipartisan bill, but I don't think, for example, she's not like a cheerleader for an assault weapons ban when Biden calls for one, for example. So that's where I see her perhaps being more Angus King-ish with her new independence.
Perhaps.
Maybe more moderate stuff she'll be willing to throw her support behind, but could perhaps be a roadblock when it comes to bigger stuff like gun bans. But of course, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a pretty big shakeup in Washington. Not sure the last time. Usually, if you're an independent, you run as an independent.
Right.
So it's fairly significant that she went from a registered Democrat to a registered independent. That is a unusual move. Usually, the other thing that's usual in Washington, not that party switching is all that common, but generally you just go from one party to the other party. You don't make a stop in between to independent town. You generally, independents that make their way into the Senate or Congress do so by running that way as independents, and usually as an independent that is extremely closely aligned with one of the particular political parties. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to affect gun policy. Probably doesn't have that much effect. Maybe it has effect on the judges, depending on how, she perhaps will be more independent in how she votes on judges moving forward. I don't know. I don't think her record is blocking a lot of, judicial picks to this point. So probably not. But maybe, if she's trying to bolster her position as the sort of new maverick of Arizona or what have you, she might have to take more stands on practical votes, but maybe not. That's kind of been her thing to some degree already, slowing down the Biden agenda,
right?
And going against her own party. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. My guess is it doesn't have a huge impact on gun policy one way or the other, because she was already a marginally, a moderate Democrat when it came to gun policy, and it's probably the position she's going to stick with moving forward. And with Republicans taking control of the House, it's very unlikely you're going to see a lot of gun control measures make it to the Senate. They're not likely to be a very big issue in the next couple of years, just because they already did a gun bill. And I think a lot of senators view that as something that they don't want to go back to again. But obviously events change things. As news events unfold, anything can happen. And certainly with a new 50-51, or what is it, 49-1-50, I guess now, if we're going by caucusing, that would be, I guess, the breakdown at this point.
Yeah.
And how often is she going to side with the Republicans to do things, and how often is she going to side with Democrats? That'll be the big thing to watch for. And it'll probably have some effect on those appointments we discussed earlier. But that's not the only news we have for you today. As interesting as that development is, we also have some updates on the California fee shifting provision that's being challenged. This is where essentially California is copycatting Texas's abortion bounty law, right? And part of that was a provision where if you sue the state, in California's case, over their gun laws, and you don't win all of your claims, you will be responsible, and your lawyers too, for paying the legal fees of the state. Even if you've won on every claim except for a single one, you will still be responsible for paying the legal fees of the state. So even in cases where you prevail, the plaintiffs prevail, the state will receive payments for their legal fees. And so this is obviously a huge issue for gun litigation. It makes it far more difficult to actually sue the state. And so there's been recent development, or two recent developments, I guess. You wrote about one at the end of last week. There's Judge Benitez, who's very well known for doing gun cases at the federal level out in California, right? He's involved in this legal fight now. Is that right?
Yeah. So he issued a ruling last Friday, basically saying that California had argued that this was a moot issue. So two gun rights groups filed suit against this fee shifting provision. And California's attorney general basically argued, I've publicly said I'm not going to enforce this fee shifting provision unless a separate judge overseeing the Texas abortion law says that that's constitutional. So basically admitting it's a kind of a political play. And so the whole ball was in the first place. The whole idea was like, if you're going to pass this for abortion, we're going to pass it for guns. Right. And, sort of a spite move. A tit for tat kind of move. And Benitez basically said, look, that's not good enough. Just having your word that you're not going to enforce it doesn't mean that this isn't a controversy and it's not having an ongoing chilling effect on litigation, as you pointed out. That's really discouraging to gun groups trying to make constitutional claims if they think that even if they're mostly successful, they're on the hook for a bunch of fees. So he said,
and it has had that exact fact. Yeah, because there have been gun rights groups that have pulled out of certain cases. They're basically prioritizing cases they are far more sure they'll win, and they're paring down what they're claiming in those cases. So it is having a literal practical effect, a chilling effect.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's essentially what Benitez's argument was. And he said, this isn't moot. We're going to let this litigation go forward. We'll have an injunction hearing on it. And in the interim between that ruling and the injunction hearing, you actually had Attorney General Rob Bonta come out and say that he will no longer be defending this law because of his previous statements that he's made about the corollary law in the Texas abortion case, where he said it was unconstitutional. Called it flatly unconstitutional. So now that he's tasked in his position with defending a law that he's called unconstitutional, he said, I can't do it. I'm stepping out of the case. And I guess someone from the governor's office is going to step in now to try to defend the law.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting development. It's not very common that an attorney general is going to recuse themselves from defending a law that they've called unconstitutional in the past. It does happen sometimes, right? The government will sometimes abandon defense of various laws. You've seen this occur in the past at the federal and state level. Usually, though, it's because the law had been passed by, a different administration and they don't agree with it politically. This time, it was passed by Democrats in California and at the urging of the attorney general, even though he clearly knows it's not constitutional. And so it's interesting to see that play out in court to where he can't even defend the law because of this. And we'll see how well they succeed. They've been trying to just short circuit this whole thing by saying, well, we're just not going to enforce this provision. But I could see why a federal judge might not find that to be a convincing argument. Well, all right, we're not going to enforce it right now. A lot of judges have taken that to this point to be, good enough that if the state says they're not going to seek these damages, then that's fine. We don't need to litigate this. You've seen that a couple times now in other cases. And, I guess Benitez is not taking the same position because clearly the law being in effect is having a chilling effect on gun litigation in the state, which I think should concern federal judges and, lawyers associations alike. This doesn't just make plaintiffs the actual plaintiffs liable for the fees. It makes their lawyers liable too, which is a pretty radical thing. A lot of stuff came out of that Texas law and California copying it that, in hindsight, you wonder if the supporters of the Texas law really thought this through very well, because the Supreme Court was on the verge of striking down Roe v. Wade anyway. And, the practical effect of that law is basically nil, while the legal effect of it and the way that it's cascaded out to be like a tit for tat approach elsewhere is obviously extremely negative. So